I tell anyone who will listen, which is why I always get a seat to myself on the bus, that the only thing that makes city life possible today is our technologically based infrastructure. If that fails, or when it does, it's going to be Lord of the Flies time. The Romans were as aware of that as I am. Well, the best of their leaders were. And when we look at Rome, as we will in this lecture in AD 120, we will see it under an emperor, Hadrian, who was emperor from 117 to 138 AD, who was in fact among the best of their leaders. As one of what have been called the five good emperors, Hadrian knew that the city of Rome, much of which was built in a floodplain and of flammable materials, needed infrastructure and maintenance, and that poor Roman citizens needed to feel that they were as much the beneficiaries of empire as were the wealthy. Now, before we go too far into the city of Rome in AD 120, let me give you a bit of context. Rome had been a city, according to the Romans themselves, since 753 BC. It grew up gradually there on the spot next to the banks of the Tiber, and actually grew up kind of organically. The historian Livy tells us that after the sack of the Gauls in 386 BC, Rome was not so much planned as occupied. People just settled wherever. From its location in the center of Italy on the banks of the Tiber and in the center of the Mediterranean, it gradually expanded into an empire that by the time of Hadrian covered territory from Scotland in the northwest to Morocco in the southwest, Israel to the east, and parts of Germany to the northeast. Now, Hadrian was a Hellenophile, that is, a lover of things Greek, so that when he added to the city, he continued the Greek influence on the buildings of the city that had been developing since the 1st century BC. Rome itself, at the time of Hadrian, was at the height of its size and population. It was the largest city in the history of the world since Uruk in the 2nd millennium BC. Rome at this time had perhaps 2 million inhabitants. So in this lecture, let's walk through a day in Rome with an ordinary Roman. At the time of Hadrian, a Roman who engages with the programs, spaces, and structures that make his life in this massive city not just bearable, but enjoyable. Let's start with home life. Thanks to Nero, yes, Nero I feel doesn't get enough credit for the good things he did, but I never seem to be able to persuade anybody of that, so let's move on. But thanks to Nero, Rome in AD 120 benefited from very good building codes. It was the first city in antiquity to do so, in fact. Nero, after the Great Fire of 64 AD, instituted building codes that widened the streets, required that buildings have fireproof ground floors, eliminated party walls so fire could not sweep through an entire block, and ensured that newly constructed buildings were designed to aid firefighting, with balconies built onto the outside of them, and in fact, firefighting materials required in each building. So really, it's a different city. The Roman who will be accompanying on our walk is Marcus Ulpius Hermes. And this isn't just a name that I created. This is the name of an actual sculptor of the period, a man whose work you can find in the Louvre today as a tremendous relief of the period, actually with his signature on it. He lives in Rome in what we term an insula. Now, insula is the Latin word for island. And this is actually a freestanding apartment complex, generally in most cases 3 to 5 stories tall, and it takes up an entire block, which is why it's called an insula or an island. In fact, building codes limited these to 70 feet, or about 21.5 meters in height. Again, thank you, Nero. These were the first high-rise buildings in world history, made without modern construction materials and techniques or technology. So they're pretty remarkable. They had shops on the ground floor facing the streets around, and apartments in every floor above. An insula might be home to around 350 people in each building, with perhaps 6 to 8 in each apartment. One prime example of an insula was constructed where you can still see its remains today on the west slope of the Capitoline Hill. That's an area that's close to all of the major public buildings and spaces in the old Forum Romanum and its extensions built under successive emperors. So it's in a very desirable location. We'll see a multi-room apartment in a clean, safe, modern building with built-in toilets for the residents. These were placed generally under the staircases where we would have storage area. They placed the toilets. It's on the slopes of the Capitoline Hill, the most important religious space in the city. So this citizen, our Marcus Ulpius Hermes, before he even leaves his apartment in the morning, has already experienced a number of benefits of Roman government, thanks to the building codes of Nero and thanks to the proximity to all of these great resources around him. The old Forum Romanum was just a short walk from Hermes Insula, and it's a remarkably symbolically significant setting. Although many elements of Roman government had by this time moved out of what was a very cramped space, emperors still used the Forum Romanum as a stage for acts of political theater. They were designed to benefit the citizens of Rome at large, and more specifically, were designed to remind the citizens of Rome of their benefits. For example, the Emperor Hadrian arranged 2 events here that we know of. One was apparently held only once, but the other was repeated regularly. The single event was the burning of the tax records as a visible way to demonstrate his commitment to forgive the back taxes owed by Roman citizens. The records were taken out of the archives. The building, it's really on the edge of the Forum. They were all piled up and burned in the Forum, surrounded by the monuments of a great Roman past. We actually have one image of that in Roman relief, and I think it's a great visual. You see them piling up the tax records there, preparing to set them on fire right in the center of the Forum. The second event on the same stage was the distribution of the alimenta. These are the grain distributions. This duty fell to the Roman emperors, who acted as the great patrons of the city. Really, well, the entire empire, but in this case, the city at large. And they ensured free or at least affordable grain. This was not intended as the poor's only supply of food, but to serve as an important supplement to their diets. What we have is a regular distribution that goes to every Roman citizen, perhaps we believe monthly, and serve to augment their diet with effectively a couple of bushels of wheat. The amount of wheat, or other grains, but mainly wheat, imported into Rome every year from Egypt was about 20 million modii, which in modern terms is about 180 million liters or 5.6 million bushels. This is actually an extraordinary amount to be, well, all planted, harvested, transported, and distributed all by hand. Remember, there's no technological farming in the ancient world, no mechanized farming. The distributions of the alimenta were conducted at a number of places around the city, probably organized based on the 14 administrative districts that Augustus divided the city into. But like that image that we have of the burning of the tax records, we have another relief which shows the alimenta taking place in the Forum. Well, once he had collected and stored his grain safely back at home, Hermes might walk about 5 minutes north of his insula to the Forum of Trajan. Begun by Hadrian's immediate predecessor, but completed by Hadrian himself at about this time, the Forum of Trajan was the largest and grandest of all of the 5 extensions of the old Forum Romanum. In fact, the Forum of Trajan was the largest single building complex ever built in ancient Rome. It contained a great basilica, a multi-purpose space mainly used for law courts, an open piazza, which was really punctuated by an equestrian statue of Trajan himself. This piazza form was the organizing principle for Roman public spaces, both civic and religious, from the time of Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great onward. The Romans took that form, notably the open piazza surrounded by a peristyle, a colonnade on all four sides, from the Greeks, but they used it more widely than the Greeks had ever done. Also found here in the Forum was the Atrium Libertatis, where the names of slaves were recorded as citizens upon their manumission, the Column of Trajan, the Temple of the deified Trajan, just being completed by Hadrian around AD 120, and two libraries, public libraries. Libraries in Rome were always built in pairs, one for Latin literature and one for Greek. I think this is an interesting convention that suggests the equal importance of both to Roman society. The first public libraries in Rome were built by the first Roman Emperor Augustus and placed in the sanctuary of Apollo on the Palatine Hill. But additional pairs of libraries, public ones, were constructed by the Emperor Vespasian in his Forum and Trajan in his Forum. Being public libraries, they were open to all who could read. We're a little unclear on exactly what the conditions were of the libraries, whether you could borrow things or just read them there. But nonetheless, we know for certain that they're open for everyone. As an educated Greek former slave, Hermes could read Latin and Greek. He might visit one of these to read one of the categories of works that we know were found here, arranged in a way that's based on ancient library organization. And we know this actually because we have some of the catalogs of ancient libraries. Poetry and prose works were shelved separately, not by subject, but by genre. Poetry was divided into 6 categories: comedy, tragedy, epic, elegy, iambics, and melodrama, and prose was shelved by the genres of history, philosophy, medicine, law, and rhetoric. Since job training in antiquity was almost exclusively oral, there was very little in the way of practical literature as we know it. The assumption was that we believe most of the lower class could not read, and so those people who were trained orally, and that included sculptors, gladiators, any number of people. The one actually major exception that we have in terms of training manuals were for Roman generals. Political leaders who were expected to go out and lead the army had little handbooks that they could carry out with them that helped them, gave them little guides. They were titled things like "Teach Yourself How to Be a Roman General." And that's really the only sort of practical literature that we know of. Well, Hermes may have stopped in at one of these libraries to read a book of poetry, certainly not unknown in the ancient or modern world. Immediately behind the Forum of Trajan was one of the greatest architectural achievements in all of ancient Rome, the Market of Trajan. This was designed by Apollodorus of Damascus, Trajan's chief architect, and completed in about 10 years prior to this time in AD 110. This was a 6-story brick-faced concrete complex containing dozens of small shops and offices. Architecturally, the building is a triumph in overcoming of obstacles. The reason is because it was built against a cut in the hill, so that behind it is, on one side, is just a cliff of solid rock. Given the lack of reliable artificial light in the Roman world, a multi-story complex built against a cliff with no access from that side, no light or air from there, presents enormous challenges, particularly to lighting the lower stories. Apollodorus turned to brick-faced concrete, that is, a poured concrete structure with a facing on it that made it look like a brick wall, a Roman invention, meaning that the markets rely on Roman materials and techniques to create an extraordinary complex of over 150 individual shops and offices. These are created in great rounded forms with barrel-vaulted passages and compound domed spaces supported by piers, not solid walls, and lighted by enormous transoms and windows and large doorways. The use of concrete essentially allowed Apollodorus to convert traditional Roman forms of the arch and vault into larger and more sophisticated structures. Many of the commodities that we know were for sale here in the market were imported from the East, that is, from as far away as India and China. And they would be sold here in, well, market stalls. These included pepper, for which one of the streets in the complex was named. Hermes might come here to check with an importer about an order of marble for a commissioned piece of sculpture. He might come here to shop, or he might come here to visit one of the offices. The central feature of the complex is what is known as the main market hall, a vaulted space over 91 feet, that's about 28 meters long, with 2 stories of 6 shops on each level on each side of the hall. Those in the upper story were set back from the line of shops on the lower story and fronted by a corridor with balustraded openings, that is, not a solid wall, but pierced openings, corresponding to the 6 bays of the central vault. This refinement of 2 stories with the second one set back creates an open space in front of the line of the shops, which allows light to pour into both stories of the hall. The vault above the entire thing is not a solid barrel vault, but is cross-vaulted, lifting the roof in each bay as an extra refinement to provide light into the space. So the vault doesn't rest on solid walls, which would block the light. It's lifted up and it rests on piers that support this very utilitarian yet innovative structure, which uses concrete construction to offset the difficulties of the site, creating a multi-storied interior space of the type previously only seen in imperial palaces. The benefits of the rule of the emperors come down here to everyone. Each of the shops, the tabernae, has an open door surmounted by an open transom or window above the doorframe, while each end of the ground floor of the market and, well, the entire market complex terminates in a space lighted by great windows under a vaulted roof and a form of skylight to carry the light into the interior spaces, passageways, and staircases. The way that the upper stories are each stepped back from the lower ones enhances this effect. Now, the markets of Trajan were built into the Quirinal Hill. The next hill to the east was the Esquiline, and it featured another great benefit for the Romans, the Baths of Trajan. Although only about a 20-minute walk to the baths, Hermes might stop along the way to take refreshment at one of the popinae or wine bars. These were found on virtually every street corner in Roman cities. Remember, the ground floors of insulae are all shops facing the streets, and the good space, the great location, is on the corner, so you get the traffic from both sides. What we find on most of these corners, and sometimes on every corner of a street, are these little wine bars. These allowed for a quick midday snack or a simple meal to be eaten standing at a counter or seated at a table, or in some of the larger ones, reclining on a dining couch surrounding a table for more formal refreshment. You might be surprised to hear that the insulae, even the most luxurious and modern of them, didn't have kitchens. There's no provision for cooking in them. I think that this is really a holdover from the fear of fire in ancient Rome, so that we don't have ovens, we don't have stoves. What this means is that most people, we believe, would eat their meals out in public. And so this dining becomes really a common shared activity. And rather than being a part of the private space of the home, it occurs out in public. Now, we do think also that these wine bars or popinae were also used for effectively carry-out food. People would get things and might bring them back. And in some cases, they would go to the popinae not just to dine there or to get carry-out back home, but they would get carry-out to take with them to the bath complexes. Dining or snacking at the baths was one of the most common activities there. And so let's turn our attention now, as we go with Hermes, to the Baths of Trajan. The Baths of Trajan, begun in AD 104, were the largest of this type of complex built up to this time. Like earlier imperial baths, they consisted of a large central bathing block with symmetrically organized rooms, all within an immense walled enclosure that included formal gardens and exercise grounds around the main block. the complex gave green space to the majority of Romans who lived in small enclosed apartments. The construction here, like at the markets, was all brick-faced concrete, with a variety of roofing systems, including soaring domes, half-domes, barrel and groin vaults, all about 100 feet or about 30 meters above the floor. It's a tremendous complex, both in floor plan and in height. The interior walls, up to the top of the walls, that is, to the base of the vaults, were lined with polychrome marble veneers and freestanding granite columns on projecting brackets. Large windows with insulating glass filled the areas just below the roofs, allowing raking light to penetrate the complex. As even the best Roman insulae did not have running water, the baths played an essential role in the hygiene of Roman citizens. The actual bathing in these complexes took place in rooms and baths heated to a variety of levels of heat for a full range of sensory experiences. They relied on a vast, well-working infrastructure of aqueducts to deliver the water and drains to take it away, along with massive furnaces to heat the water and the rooms themselves. The per capita running water capacity in Rome at this time was enormous. It's calculated by some scholars at about 67 liters a person a day, an amount not equaled again in a city for 1,700 years. Not until London, actually. Those who experienced these baths could not help but receive the lesson that the Roman system worked, and that their government directly benefited these bathers, as well as the large number of Romans who were employed in the construction of the complex, because this is a jobs program as well. I'd like to say a word here about the name bath or bath complex, because I think it's misleading to us today. We think of a large bathroom with a lot of people bathing together, and that's certainly part of what goes on here. But we really need to think of these spaces more like public spas. We have the rich range of baths from hot to cold and dry to steam saunas. We also have areas for exercise of a variety. Lectures would be held here. Philosophers would teach in the space. Doctors would see patients, and people would come for a massage or a haircut, and a rich variety of activities. So these buildings, these complexes really, aren't just baths. They're really, I think, much more. They're getaways for the common people. In addition to the activities for which the building was designed and named, that is, bathing, a great amount of networking and socializing took place here, as Romans of every level of society came to the baths. In fact, the Emperor Hadrian himself was known to bathe in the large public baths just like other Romans, non-Romans, foreigners, and even slaves. According to Roman authors, one of the primary activities in the baths was procuring dinner invitations from one's social superiors. These men, the social superiors, the elite in Rome, were expected to share their wealth through generosity. Sometimes this meant building public buildings, underwriting alimenta, paying for support for widows and orphans, things that benefited the community at large for which their names would be associated. Other times it's a more informal generosity. And some Romans counted on that informal generosity for meals. Other times Romans would, as we do, run into friends whom they would invite over to dine after bathing. Hermes, not being impoverished, would probably be in the latter category of those who joined friends for dinner, and not those sitting around trying desperately to figure out how to get an invitation to dinner from a wealthy Roman. The Roman poet Juvenal, a contemporary of Hadrian's, who's famous for his biting observations of urban life, captures the most positive perspective on the dinner invitation in his Satire 11. But now relinquish care, put business aside, and treat yourself to a pleasant interlude in which you may idle the whole day away. There'll not be a mention of payments due. Throw off whatever annoys you at my door. What a great idea. A pleasant, leisurely meal with other Romans held in a triclinium, that's the formal dining room with 3 dining couches, tri, 3, and clinium, the dining couches on which one would recline. Generally held 9 diners, so 3 per couch. This is the standard formal dinner party in ancient Rome. In addition to multiple courses of food and drink, Juvenal, after all, says that this could go on all day, there would be good conversation and entertainment, perhaps a poet reading recent compositions, or music. We know in a number of cases of the types of entertainment at these dinner parties. Not just poets, but historians, Tacitus or Livy, might come in and read some of their original and recent compositions. And then the expectation is that the diners would talk about these, because the entertainment was considered to be not just passive entertainment, but as sort of a prompt for the discussion that would follow. Sometimes it would be based on the readings of poetry or history, sometimes on the music that would be performed. Other times, there would be conversations about mythology, and we think that the mythological paintings that were placed here in these dining rooms were actually used as prompts, and people would consider looking at a painting of Odysseus on his way home to Penelope, asking themselves, what would constitute a good life? Or, things like this. And these would be sort of philosophical conversations that would take place. Well, the walk home after one of these dinners could be accompanied by slaves from the household who would bear torches in front of the diner to light the way. If there was a wealthy person or even a middle-class elite, they would have a couple of slaves. And Hermes, our Roman, would go home relatively trouble-free, thanks to the slaves lighting his way and to the institution of the vigiles, or the vigiles, the Roman watch, and to the cohortes urbanae, that is, the city police force, both of which were instituted under the Roman emperors and both paid for by taxes. Now, this day with Hermes was admittedly idealized, but it's not outside the realm of possibility. It's based on historical buildings, spaces, and activities. As a matter of fact, I myself have done this walk just as I've described it to you, starting at the Insula on the Capitoline, moving to the Forum and Markets of Trajan, and then passing over to the Esquiline Hill. It's an easy walk, and it gives a great sense of how Rome worked in antiquity. But this was, as I must admit, a day in which everything went perfectly. It's a day that's really designed to give you that sense of the benefits of the Roman world to the citizens and really non-citizens who were the inhabitants of the city of Rome at this time. In the next lecture, we'll look again at Rome, this time at the city at the same period from the perspective of someone who is having an awful day, someone for whom the system is not working. These existed as well in the same city and at the same time that Hermes lived. And I think it's important to consider the life in Rome of those on the other side.